In the autumn of 1216, Newark Castle was thick with the stench of death. King John, the anointed sovereign of England, lay writhing on a filthy bed, his bloated body torn apart by dysentery. The disease drained him hour by hour, but no one came to ease his suffering. Priests did not rush to his side with holy oil. Courtiers did not whisper prayers for his recovery. Even his servants, bound by duty, turned their faces away, some murmuring quiet thanks that England's tormentor was finally meeting his end. The chronicles are unusually unanimous. Here was a king so despised that his death was not mourned, but celebrated. John's reign was not simply cruel in the way medieval kings were often cruel. He had perfected a more insidious weapon, humiliation. Other monarchs shed blood to secure power. John sought something deeper. He aimed to hollow out his enemies' dignity, to leave them alive but broken. His chosen instrument was lust. The sacred vows of marriage became tools of domination in his hands. While his knights bled on distant fields to defend his realm, John prowled their empty castles, taking their wives and parading them like trophies. To the barons who served him, there was no wound so bitter as returning home to find honour corrupted and lineage mocked. Chroniclers struggled to capture the scope of his depravity. Matthew Paris, the great monk of St. Albans, recorded that John was possessed by demons and guilty of acts that no decent man could describe. Yet, describe them they did, for silence could not erase the suffering he caused. Consider William de Braose, once among the king's closest allies. When he fell from favour, John seized his lands and claimed his wife Matilda as his mistress. For William, there was no recourse but quiet despair. But when he dared to resist, John's cruelty deepened. William was imprisoned and starved to death, his family forced to watch. Matilda herself was later confined with her young son in a stone cell and left to waste away her final hours, recorded in whispers of cannibal desperation. This was not the casual indulgence of royal appetite. The medieval world accepted that kings had mistresses. It was understood as part of power. John's twist was to turn private indulgence into public theatre. Husbands were forced to serve at feasts where their wives, draped in jewels, stolen from their own estates, sat at John's side. One knight returning from crusade discovered that not only had John bedded his wife, but forced her to write letters describing their encounters. At banquets, John would read these aloud, laughing, as the cuckolded man stood powerless, oath-bound, not to defy his sovereign. Here lay John's genius for cruelty. True power, he understood, was not in killing, but in making a man wish for death. By the time his corpse was carried from Newark Castle, England had endured 17 years of this degradation. The Magna Carta forced upon him by his barons stands as history's most famous rebuke to tyranny. But no charter could restore the wives defiled, the children born of shame, the honour crushed beneath the weight of a crown. So when the people heard he was dead, there were no laments, only the uneasy silence of a kingdom that had lived too long in the shadow of a predator. His reign is remembered not as an age of glory, but as an abyss, proof of what happens when unchecked power strips away every boundary of decency. And yet, to understand how John became this monster, one must first return to the soil that bred him. For a predator is not born in a vacuum. He is shaped by the venom of his own bloodline. To understand the monstrosity of King John, we must step back half a century to his birth. On Christmas Eve in 1166, within the walls of Beaumont Palace in Oxford, John entered a world already poisoned by ambition and betrayal. He was the youngest son of Henry II of England and Eleanor of Aquitaine, a union that produced not a family but a battlefield. Love in that household was weakness. Cruelty was the only coin that carried weight. Henry II was a man of volcanic tempers, so fierce that witnesses recalled him rolling on the floor in fury, gnawing straw like a beast. His willpower built an empire stretching from Scotland to the Pyrenees, but it also set father against sons in endless feuds. Eleanor of Aquitaine, one of the most formidable women of the Middle Ages, matched her husband's fire with cunning and rebellion. She encouraged her sons to rise against their father, sparking wars that drenched the dynasty in blood. John's elder brothers embodied this legacy of violence. Henry the young king died while conspiring to overthrow his father. Richard later called the Lionheart won glory in the Crusades, but stained it with rivers of blood, ordering the execution of 3,000 Muslim prisoners at Acre. Geoffrey, Duke of Brittany, perished in a tournament crushed by horses amid whispers of assassination. This was the world that cradled John, a family of lions and serpents, where survival demanded teeth as sharp as daggers. And yet, John, the runt of the brood, was not feared, but mocked. He was given no inheritance, no territory, no power. His nickname spat at him like a curse was Lackland, for a medieval princeland was not just wealth, it was identity, honor, and destiny. To be called Lackland was to be branded a nobody. That wound festered deep in him, scarring the boy who would grow into a man obsessed with domination. But John was not without gifts. He possessed a sharp, calculating mind. Unlike many princes, he could read and write in Latin, French, and English. He studied law with a zeal few of his peers could match. Yet where others absorbed lessons of justice and chivalry, John learned only manipulation. Laws to him were not boundaries, but chains to fasten around others. Mercy was folly. Weakness invited contempt. From the shadows, he learned that the surest path to power lay not in battlefield glory, but in breaking men's spirits. The world around him offered plenty of examples. Medieval England in the late 12th century was already cruel beyond modern comprehension. Justice often meant trial by ordeal, plunging a hand into boiling water, or carrying a red-hot iron. Survival depended not on innocence, but on whether wounds festered. Castle dungeons echoed with screams. Bishops grew fat on estates worked by peasants who were scarcely freer than slaves. Even the church, which claimed to be a check on kings, was mired in corruption. Priests with concubines, monks hoarding wealth indulgences, sold like trinkets at a market stall. Hypocrisy was the air John breathed. Perhaps the most searing moment of his youth came in 1189, at his father's deathbed. Henry II, broken by rebellion, discovered that even John, his favoured son, the one closest to his heart, had betrayed him secretly, bargaining with his enemies. According to chroniclers, Henry's last words were a curse. "Is it true, John? My own heart, whom I loved most, has forsaken me. Truly, he is the worst of all my children." In that final damnation, John inherited not merely a kingdom in waiting, but the venom of betrayal as his defining legacy. When the Lionheart. Richard died in 1199 from a crossbow wound. The crown should have passed to Arthur of Brittany, a boy with the stronger claim. But John, scarred by mockery, sharpened by treachery, and determined never again to be called Lackland, moved with ruthless speed. He had learned from the viper's nest that only the most venomous serpent survives. His chance had come, and he seized it with both hands. Richard, the Lionheart's death in 1199, opened a vacuum at the very heart of Christendom's greatest empire. To many, the natural heir was Arthur of Brittany, Richard's 12-year-old nephew. John, though older, stood on weaker legal ground. Yet in the violent game of thrones that defined Plantagenet politics, bloodlines mattered less than speed and ruthlessness. John mocked for years as Lackland would not let the prize slip away. Even before Richard's body had cooled, John moved with startling precision. He seized the royal treasury at Chinon, securing the coin and jewels that oiled the gears of loyalty. Bribes flowed quickly. Bishops and barons, dazzled by immediate reward, found themselves drawn into his orbit. Within days he rode to Westminster, where he crowned himself king before Arthur's supporters had even decided their next move. But the ceremony itself seemed cursed. A bat flitted through the abbey's vaulted roof, circling the altar like a restless spirit. Worse still, when the crown was lowered onto John's head, it slipped clattering to the stones in a sound that many swore echoed like a funeral bell. For those who witnessed it, this was no coronation but an omen of disaster. Arthur did not fade quietly. In 1202, the boy led forces against his uncle with French backing. At the Battle of Mirabeau, John captured him alive a moment that might have been redeemed with mercy. Instead, history enters the shadows. The chronicles diverge, but all versions are grim. Some claimed John, drunk and raging, murdered the boy with his own hands. Others whispered that Arthur was blinded and mutilated before being flung into the River Seine. A knight named William de Brieux, present in those dark days, later muttered that John had killed his nephew while possessed by the devil. The murder of a child, his own blood sent shockwaves through Christendom. Medieval kings had killed rivals before, but this act crossed a line that even that brutal age recoiled from. Chroniclers in France wrote that nature itself seemed to shudder. Philip Augustus, King of France, seized the moment, declaring John's continental lands forfeit. Normandy, Anjou, and vast stretches of the Angevin Empire began to slip from England's grasp. The mighty dominion built by Henry II and Eleanor was unravelling in John's hands. John's response was not to rally his barons with courage, but to retreat inward, gripped by paranoia and lust. The barons expected a king to lead them in reclaiming lost lands. Instead, they watched in dismay as John demanded hostages, wives and daughters of the nobility, under the pretext of securing loyalty. In truth, he was assembling unwilling companions for a royal harem. Political collapse abroad became the excuse for personal predation at home. It was in this period that Isabella of Angoulême entered John's life. Barely 12 years old when he took her as his queen, she was a child forced into a nightmare. Chroniclers describe how John flaunted her at court, subjecting her to indignities that knights whispered of only in hints. More chilling still, he delighted in forcing her to watch, as he bedded others sometimes in their very marriage chamber. Even by the jaded standards of medieval royalty, this was depravity that froze tongues. Thus, within the first years of his reign, John had stained his crown with a nephew's blood, lost the ancestral heartlands of his dynasty, and transformed the throne of England into a seat of terror. To the barons who had sworn oaths of loyalty, it became increasingly clear their king was not merely ruthless, he was a predator, and the kingdom itself his hunting ground. By the early years of the 13th century, John had turned his court into something grotesque, a theatre of humiliation. Where other kings kept mistresses in secrecy, John wielded adultery as a weapon of state. Marriage, the foundation of noble loyalty, became the very battlefield on which he crushed the will of his barons. He understood the psychology of honour better than most. A man might bear the loss of land or coin, even endure imprisonment, but to watch his wife taken his lineage mocked his very household corrupted. That was a torment few could withstand. John did not hide these violations. He paraded them. Husbands were forced to bow before wives clothed in royal silks. Women transformed overnight from noble matrons into unwilling ornaments of the crown. The case of Robert Fitzwalter reveals the depth of John's cruelty. His wife Matilda, renowned for her beauty, was seized by the king. John forced Robert to stand guard outside the bedchamber while she was defiled, hearing her cries yet unable to intervene. This was not lust alone. It was calculated domination, the shattering of a man's very soul. When Fitzwalter later rebelled, his rallying cry was not for land or taxes, but for violated honour. John refined these torments through an organised network. At its centre was a shadowy figure known as Black Margot, a woman tasked with scouting noble households for beauty that might please the king. Under the guise of royal summons, perhaps a legal dispute, perhaps a request to serve as lady-in-waiting, women were lured to court only to find themselves trapped in John's web. Their families could do nothing. To resist the king was treason. To submit was degradation. Either choice destroyed them. The humiliations were often public. At feasts, John would summon cuckolded husbands to serve wine, while their wives sat at his side fed from his own hand. Chroniclers note with horror that he would describe his encounters in mocking detail before assembled guests. Once when a crusader returned to discover his wife compromised, John forced her to pen letters recounting their intimacy. These the king read aloud at banquets, laughing at the broken silence of a man whose oaths of loyalty bound him to obedience. The church, in theory, might have been expected to intervene, yet bishops often owed their positions to John's favour. Many remained silent, their voices purchased with lands or gold. Some even blessed his marriages in mock ceremonies, sealing degradation with a parody of sacred rites. Only when John overstepped once seizing the wife of a papal envoy did Rome begin to stir with Pope Innocent III, thundering that England's court had become a brothel more vile than Sodom. Still for years, John acted unchecked. His court was a stage where loyalty was tested not by fealty in battle, but by endurance of shame. He knew that broken men were easier to rule than proud ones. By dismantling the sanctity of marriage, he struck at the very foundation of baronial identity. England's nobility found themselves bound to a king who did not merely tax their lands or command their swords. He reached into their beds, their families, their very souls. It was this inversion of power, this calculated desecration of what was sacred, that transformed political opposition into something far more dangerous. For once, honour itself is defiled, rebellion is no longer ambition, it is survival. By 1208, John had refined his campaign of humiliation into something systematic. Royal progresses, once symbols of a monarch's bond with his people, became the king's hunting expeditions. Where past rulers travelled to affirm loyalty and dispense justice, John's tours were remembered as the progress of shame. His arrival at a noble household was less a visit than a siege one no lord could refuse without inviting charges of treason. The pattern was grotesquely predictable. John would demand a lavish feast, then surrounded by mercenaries, survey the women of the household as though selecting horses at market. He appraised their bodies openly, discussing their attributes with companions, while husbands sat powerless. To be noticed was disaster. To be overlooked, a momentary reprieve. The case of Helwys de Stuteville, wife of William de Stuteville of Yorkshire, was infamous. While her husband fought in Ireland, she prepared a splendid welcome for John, hoping to secure his favour. Instead, the king lingered at their castle for 3 weeks. When Helwys finally reappeared in records, she was a ghost of herself, described by witnesses as whispering of demons and hellfire. The court knew what had been done, yet no one dared speak aloud. John added a veneer of legality to his predations. Noblewomen were compelled to sign contracts written in Latin most could not read, declaring their voluntary submission to the king's desires. These documents became chains of silence. Should a woman later protest, her own seal was produced as evidence against her. Coercion was dressed in the trappings of law, transforming rape into royal prerogative. The rituals surrounding these conquests were chilling. A chamberlain was tasked with preparing unwilling women forced bathing-scented oils, cosmetics applied like war paint. Victims were dressed in garments John favoured before being delivered to his bed. Chroniclers suggest that the psychological terror of this ritual often broke women before the king even touched them. Nor was the abuse purely physical. Financial extortion accompanied every violation. Husbands paid enormous fines for the honour of their wives having received the king's attention, or further sums to ensure he would not visit again. One grim ledger entry records, from William D.M., 1,000 marks for the king's 3 nights' comfort with his lady, and 500 more that his majesty might not return. John's cruelty was profitable as well as perverse. The corruption spread through his administration. Sheriffs and bailiffs learned that delivering attractive women to the king earned rewards. False charges became common tools of coercion. A woman accused of theft might be threatened with torture unless she sought mercy directly from John. A mercy that came at unbearable cost. Even the church was not spared his defilement. John forced women to swear before holy relics that they had submitted willingly. He conducted assaults in castle chapels, desecrating altars, with acts that made even hardened chroniclers tremble to record. One monk wrote bitterly that John compelled women to swear by the Virgin's purity that they had joyfully surrendered their own. The consequences were catastrophic. Illness spread among noble women after these encounters, whispered to be God's punishment, or the result of venereal disease. Bastard children multiplied their very existence, tearing at the fragile fabric of succession and inheritance. Husbands refused to acknowledge infants they knew were not theirs, while John revelled in the disputes, sometimes intervening to grant his bastards estates, deepening humiliation for the true fathers. What had begun as the indulgence of a king had become something larger, a system of legal rape, extortion, and desecration, woven into the very machinery of governance. John's progresses left behind them not gratitude or loyalty, but broken families, poisoned marriages, and noble houses teetering on collapse. England itself was being devoured not by foreign enemies, but by the predations of its own king. By the second decade of the 13th century, John's reign had begun to resemble not governance, but the slow unravelling of England's very soul. The great families that formed the backbone of the realm, the barons who provided armies, the noble houses that anchored its traditions, were splintering under the weight of his cruelty. The ledger of dishonour stretched from one end of the kingdom to the other. Husbands returned from foreign wars to wives transformed by shame, some whispering brokenly in convents, others carrying infants whose faces betrayed their true father. Entire marriages dissolved into bitterness and suspicion. Some men, consumed by humiliation, abandoned their estates altogether, fleeing to France or Scotland rather than endure the king's predations. Others bankrupted themselves, paying his extortionate fines, attempting in vain to purchase safety for their households. The psychological damage spread beyond the court. Noble women who had endured the king's touch carried trauma that silenced them. But the shame radiated outward, poisoning alliances, disrupting inheritance, corroding trust within the delicate lattice of feudal society. To be loyal to John meant risking one's honour. To oppose him meant risking one's life. It was a noose that tightened around the nobility until the only choices were despair or revolt. Even the sanctuary of God's house could not protect the desperate. When Alice of Thorney fled to a convent, John's men dragged her from the altar in the midst of Mass, while the abbess who tried to shield her was stripped and flogged in the courtyard. Such acts struck terror across Christendom. If the consecrated walls of a church offered no refuge, where could a woman find safety? News of John's depravity spread beyond England's shores. In Paris, Philip Augustus weaponized these accounts, presenting himself as the righteous foil to England's Nero. Letters circulated among European courts, describing John not as a flawed ruler, but as a monster who had polluted his kingdom. Diplomats hesitated to ally with him, fearing the contagion of scandal. Even merchants avoided English ports, muttering that a cursed crown brought cursed trade. but within England something unexpected began to form solidarity born of anguish. Noblemen who had once been rivals began to recognize a shared wound. In secret, they gathered at monasteries or remote castles recounting their losses, their wives' suffering, the children who bore the king's mark. Chroniclers speak of the Brotherhood of Horns, a darkly mocking name for these cuckolded lords who swore oaths of vengeance against the predator king. This was unprecedented. Feudal lords were accustomed to rebellion over taxes or lands, but never before had they been united by the collective violation of their families. Their grievance was not abstract politics. It was personal, seared into their flesh and blood. Each man carried his own story of dishonor. But together, they forged a cause larger than themselves, the need to stop a king who had turned England into his hunting ground. The seed of rebellion had been planted not in ambition, but in suffering. And like all seeds, it would one day break through the soil, watered not by rain, but by tears and blood. The spark that turned anguish into open revolt came from a woman's defiance. Matilda de Braose, wife of William de Braose, had once been part of John's inner circle. Her family held vast lands and influence, but favour with this king was as fleeting as sunlight through storm clouds. When John demanded her eldest daughter as a hostage, all knew what such a demand meant. To surrender the girl was to condemn her to the same fate suffered by countless other noble daughters, humiliation in the king's bed. Matilda did the unthinkable. She refused. In full view of the royal court, she declared that she would not deliver her child to a man who had murdered his own nephew and defiled the wives of England. Her words cut like a sword, for they named aloud the crimes that others had endured in silence. Chroniclers suggest gasps echoed through the hall, for this was not merely defiance of a king, it was a mother's public accusation against tyranny itself. John's response was swift and merciless. He turned his armies against the de Braose strongholds. Corfe Castle, where Matilda and her children sought refuge, fell under siege. When she and her son were captured, John devised a punishment so cruel it seared itself into legend. Mother and child were locked together in a stone cell at Windsor Castle. No food was given. Guards reported hearing cries that dwindled into silence. When the door was finally opened, they found Matilda's son dead, and whispers spread that in her starvation, she had gnawed his flesh in desperation. The story spread like wildfire, retold with horror in every hall and abbey. Whether embellished or not, its impact was undeniable. Even men who had endured John's abuses without raising arms now felt compelled to act. If he would destroy a woman and her child in such a manner, then no family in England was safe. Matilda became more than a victim, she became a martyr. Chroniclers compared her to saints, her defiance painted as divine courage against a king possessed by infernal lust. Her death shattered the silence of the nobility. Barons who had whispered their grievances now spoke openly of vengeance. At the centre of this gathering storm stood Stephen Langton, the Archbishop of Canterbury. Exiled by John for years, he returned under papal authority carrying not only the weight of Rome, but the fury of a betrayed nation. In secret meetings at St. Paul's Cathedral, Langton read aloud testimonies from noble women who had suffered John's predations. Hardened warriors, men who had faced Saracen swords in the Holy Land, wept as they heard their wives' voices trembling on parchment. The Church, too, shifted its stance. Pope Innocent III, already enraged by John's political defiance, declared that the king's sins had reached beyond rebellion into abomination. He excommunicated John, releasing all subjects from their oaths of loyalty. Across England, priests refused to celebrate Mass in castles touched by the king's presence, declaring them polluted. It was Robert Fitzwalter, once humiliated into silence, who now stepped forward as the standard-bearer of revolt. His banner raised over London bore the cry for God and violated honour. It was a war cry, unlike any England had heard before, not for conquest or coin, but for the restoration of dignity, torn apart by a king's lust. With Matilda's martyrdom, the anguish of a nation became a cause. What had begun as private shame was transfigured into righteous fury, and that fury would soon force John to the meadow of Runnymede, where a document of rebellion would carve itself into history. The rebellion that swept England was unlike any before it. This was not a struggle over borders or taxes, it was a reckoning with a king who had defiled the very fabric of noble life. When Robert Fitzwalter's forces seized London in 1215, the balance shifted irreversibly. John, cornered and weakened, was forced to negotiate. The meeting place chosen was Runnymede, a meadow by the Thames, where history would be written in ink and fury. The barons came not as subjects begging mercy, but as accusers presenting terms to a criminal in a crown. Contemporary chronicles describe the atmosphere as seething with personal hatred. Fitzwalter, whose wife had been taken by John, reportedly refused to address the king, directly speaking only through intermediaries. To look upon John's face, he said, was to relive his wife's tears. The negotiations were brutal. When John attempted to dismiss his actions as customary rights of kingship, one noble identified by some sources as Sire de Quincy threw down a blood-stained silk scarf. It was said to be torn from his daughter's wedding night, when John had claimed her before her husband. The meadow fell silent, broken only by John's cruel laughter. Even Archbishop Stephen Langton, who mediated the talks, nearly struck the king in outrage. To reason with him, Langton later wrote, was to reason with a mad dog. Out of this cauldron of bitterness emerged the Magna Carta, a charter remembered today as the foundation of constitutional liberty. Yet buried among its clauses on justice and taxation lie the scars of John's particular crimes. Clause 54, for example, forbade imprisonment on the appeal of a woman except for the death of her husband. To modernize, it may seem obscure, but to the barons, it was a direct shield against John's twisted practice of forcing wives to accuse their own husbands in fabricated trials that allowed him access to them. Each clause was a bar in the cage they sought to build around a predator. Witnesses recorded strange scenes during the sealing of the charter. John muttered threats beneath his breath, vowing vengeance upon the families arrayed against him. William de Beauchamp. One baron present claimed the king leaned close and whispered, "Your lady wept sweetly once. She will weep again." Even as he affixed his seal, John's mind seethed with fantasies of revenge. When the document was finished, it was less a peace treaty than a desperate attempt at containment. The barons knew John's signature was worth little. Indeed, he repudiated the charter within weeks, declaring he had signed under duress. Yet the Magna Carta endured because it was born not from abstract theory, but from the blood and tears of violated families. It codified a truth that even a king must have boundaries. The Pope's intervention complicated matters. Innocent III annulled the charter siding officially with his vassal, but letters discovered later suggest the annulment was half-hearted, accompanied by secret instructions to England's clergy to continue sheltering women from John's advances. The Church could not openly betray its authority, but neither could it ignore the monstrous reality. Thus, the Magna Carta, remembered in centuries to come as a milestone of liberty, was in its own time a weapon forged in the crucible of personal grief. It was not only a political statement, it was a cry of protection, a desperate shield against a sovereign who had turned law into lust. And yet the predator was not finished. Stripped of pretense, humiliated at Runnymede, John descended further into rage and madness. The cage his barons built would not hold him for long. The Magna Carta was meant to chain the king, but John was not a man who accepted limits. Within weeks of sealing it, he declared the charter void, claiming coercion had forced his hand. Freed in his own mind, he plunged into a spiral that horrified even his enemies. What had once been cold cruelty now melted into madness. Chroniclers tell us that John became haunted by visions. At night he screamed himself awake, clawing at the air, as though surrounded by the faces of the women he had violated. His physician, Master Alexander, recorded that only wine laced with opium gave him rest, yet even in drugged stupor he muttered apologies to phantoms. His paranoia grew. He became convinced that his enemies were sending wives and daughters to seduce him as assassins. To protect himself, he ordered that all women who came near him be stripped and searched, a ritual of humiliation he personally oversaw with cruel delight. As civil war raged, his instability worsened. London fell to rebel forces who invited Prince Louis of France to claim the English crown. John fled west, dragging with him a retinue of captive women hostages, he called them, though all knew their true purpose. In grotesque ceremonies he dressed them in the gowns of his mother, Eleanor of Aquitaine, and forced them to reenact scenes from his childhood. It was as though the king sought to rewrite his own story through their degradation, trying to exorcise the curse of Lackland by asserting dominance over every female figure in his memory. The king's body too was betraying him. Chroniclers describe running sores that would not heal, foul breath teeth blackened to stumps. Some whispered of venereal disease consuming him from within, a fitting judgment for his sins. Yet even as his flesh rotted, his appetites did not abate. His court became a nightmare procession of coerced rituals, part orgy, part theatre of cruelty, each act darker than the last. In October 1216 came the final humiliation. Crossing the marshes of East Anglia with his treasure train, John lost the crown jewels, gold and sacred relics of his dynasty to the rising tide of the Wash. Soldiers reported that as the chests sank beneath the mud, John wept not for the gold, but for the personal trophies hidden within locks of hair garments, trinkets taken from the women he had broken. He called their names. One account claims like a lover mourning at graves. Soon after, disease struck him down. Dysentery racked his body, leaving him shrunken and foul. At Newark Castle, he lingered in filth, alternating between begging God's forgiveness and boasting of his conquests. His last confession was said to be so vile that the priest fled the chamber, refusing to hear more. When death finally came on October 19th, 1216, it was met not with mourning, but with grim relief. Even in death, dignity escaped him. His mercenaries stripped his corpse before it cooled, stealing rings and garments. Servants refused to wash or prepare his body. Chroniclers say his face in death bore such terror that those who looked upon it believed he had glimpsed hell itself in his final moments. Thus ended the reign of John England's predator king. His last breath poisoned with the stench of madness, his crown drowned in the marshes, his name forever cursed. When word of John's death spread across England, it was not grief that followed, it was release. After 17 years under the shadow of a predator, the kingdom seemed to exhale. Chroniclers describe a strange atmosphere, as if the land itself had been unchained. Women who had hidden for years within convent walls or remote strongholds began to emerge. Husbands who had carried humiliation in silence finally found words for their rage. A collective exorcism had begun. The coronation of John's 9-year-old son, Henry III, was unlike any before it. William Marshal, England's greatest knight, and now regent, ordered purification rites in every royal residence the old king had touched. Bishops sprinkled holy water on castle stones. Monks sang psalms in chambers once used for violation. At Westminster, priests performed solemn exorcisms, declaring that the taint of John's presence must be driven out before a new reign could begin. It was as though the entire nation believed evil itself had worn the crown. Chroniclers wrote of a phenomenon they called the flowering. In the months after John's death, marriages long poisoned by suspicion began to heal. Some noblemen, once too ashamed, now publicly acknowledged children who bore John's features, choosing acceptance over silence. Others quietly disposed of such heirs, unwilling to let their bloodlines be tainted. The scars remained, but there was also resilience. Families reforged in defiance of what they had endured. The legal ripples were profound. The Magna Carta, reissued and strengthened after John's passing, carried new emphasis on protections for widows and heirs, signalling that the law itself must serve as a shield against royal abuse. What began as an act of rebellion was now woven into the fabric of governance. From John's horrors emerged a new principle: even a king must bow before boundaries. The Church too grappled with his legacy. Officially, John received Christian burial at Worcester Cathedral, but privately, many clerics whispered that his soul was damned. Pilgrims reported visions of him writhing in hell, tormented by demonic spectres of the women he had defiled. Whether true or imagined, these stories offered survivors a sense of cosmic justice, a belief that no crown could shield a sinner from eternal punishment. For centuries, his memory remained a warning. Parents told children not to go the way of John. Chroniclers, who once recorded only battles and treaties, began to scrutinize the private morality of kings. His reign taught that tyranny was not merely political, it could be intimate, personal, and devastating. In violating the sanctity of the family, John had violated the very foundation of society. Modern historians sometimes soften him, framing his crimes within the harsh norms of the Middle Ages, but his own age judged him without hesitation. To them, John was not merely a failed ruler, he was a monster who turned kingship into predation. The very unanimity of his condemnation across English, French, and church records is rare in medieval history. It was as though the world agreed that in John something truly unnatural had walked the earth, and yet from his depravity came an unexpected legacy. The suffering he inflicted gave birth to safeguards that still shape our understanding of law and justice. His victims' tears watered the roots of liberty. Their humiliation forged protections that endure centuries later. King John's reign stands as a warning etched in history. When power acknowledges no boundaries, when desire becomes law, civilization itself trembles. He died as he lived in fear, in filth, and despised. But his shadow lingers not as glory, but as a curse, reminding us forever of what happens when a crown becomes a weapon.